Hello, everyone. This is Nicholas Capman. Welcome to the Passionate Workforce podcast. I am the author of The Passionate Workforce, How to Create and Maintain Maximum Employee Engagement, an Amazon #1 bestseller. And today I have a very special guest. I have Joe Corleone. Hello, Joe. How are you doing today?
Doing very well, thank you.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you for joining me today. We're going to be talking about leadership and management. We're going to be talking about your new book, The Touchstones of Leadership, Essential Principles for Business Leaders, that came out in September. But before we jump into the concepts of leadership and management, and obviously some aspects that readers can learn from your book, could you please introduce yourself?
Thank you. Yes, I'm Joe Carleone. I was born and raised in Philadelphia, went to school there, earned a Ph.D. in engineering, but most of my career has been in the management of businesses. My career has has experienced two separate fields. My first field, about the first half of my career, was aerospace and defense, and I was able to get a lot of experience in many different areas of that. And then I transitioned into pharmaceuticals for the second half of my career, approximately the last 25 years. And the experience in both areas were very critical in the leadership aspects that I've developed and we'll talk about later in the podcast. Um, I I I ran a number of companies especially in the pharmaceutical area. It's been primarily pharmaceutical services and manufacturing of pharmaceuticals, ingredients primarily, active ingredients and biologic ingredients for custom pharmaceuticals primarily. And throughout that, I got involved in selling portions of businesses and merging businesses with other businesses. And the most recent was I took was a CEO of a public company, American Pacific Corporation. We took it private under HIG Capital, and then we took the pieces of the businesses apart and has sold them into other businesses, and I stayed on for a period of time until the last exit. Since then, I have been on boards, Avid Bioservices, which was a biologics company. Most recently, I was chairman, and we sold that business in February, well, just last month. And and then I remain on the board of Sensient Technologies, and I also work with a colleague in Europe who has a small boutique on the buy side, and I advise that company on opportunities in the United States for his European clients to invest in. So that's what I've been doing.
Okay, so not too much. Yeah. Well, that's a great background. The thing that I'm really interested in learning is you started out in one industry, transitioned to another industry. You have a lot of experience in different aspects of business, different types of companies within pharma, and obviously previously, and then different roles. So you've probably had the opportunity to experience leadership and management from different standpoints. And my assumption is that you were able to come up with a consistent theme that can go across all of those. Is that accurate, or would you say that it's different depending on the industry or position, so on and so forth?
No, I think it's an accurate depiction. It's amazing, when people talk about aerospace and defense, and they say, "Well, how did you get into pharmaceuticals? It must be so different and everything." But from a business point of view, they're amazing. It's amazing that they're so alike in a lot of respects. One, they're both highly regulated industries, and I think that's a specialty that people pick up in managing throughout that. So you're, always concerned with compliance, quality compliance, regulatory compliance in a number of different ways in both industries. And I've been involved in the manufacturing of both. And yeah, while the technical aspects of manufacturing, from discrete manufacturing to process manufacturing, are different, manufacturing, I found, is manufacturing. And yeah, the technology is different, but you have and you need specialists in each of those areas. But from a leadership perspective and a management perspective, the work is quite similar. The problems are quite similar. The decision making is quite similar. So I think that transition and the transition, how I came upon that transition is I was working in aerospace and defense and had moved up in the organization. The company's name was Aerojet, and they in the about 25 years ago, maybe 30 years, they created a venture as aerospace was declining in the 90s, created a venture to take aerospace technology, especially in the chemistry area, and apply it to pharmaceuticals. And while the company had dabbled in that a little bit, they made a major venture, invested a lot of money, and then it was going well, and it ran into some difficulties. And our chairman came to me and asked me if I could go over, take a look, and maybe run that for a while and see what we could do, because the board was getting serious about maybe shutting the investment down. Well, I was able to go over there. We did turn that business around, and then eventually put it on the market and sold it to a company called American Pacific Corporation. That's how I got involved in mergers and acquisitions, part of my career. But it's interesting to take the technology in chemistry of rocket motors and chemistry of explosives, and apply it to pharmaceuticals was the real basis behind the venture. And it turned out very well, because many of the pharmaceutical companies don't want to deal with the hazardous chemistries and toxic chemistries that you need for certain pharmaceuticals. Many of the cancer drugs, the chemotherapy, are highly toxic. And to manufacture those, how do you protect your workers and so forth? All of that infrastructure existed in the aerospace industry, and it was very transferable. So that's how we moved into that business. And that triggered another path for me in my career, which I had never anticipated.
Okay. Well, I'm excited to learn more about the touchstones of leadership. I'm going to throw a bunch of questions out at you just to
Sure.
make it a little bit more challenging for you. So I'm curious to know where you came up with the title. I'm curious to know what inspired you to write the book. And then lastly, if you could kind of summarize the concept before we dive into the details, what is the overarching concept of the book?
Yeah, the genesis of the book and the genesis of the title came from you know the leadership style I used and developed and evolved over my career. And I would, in staff meetings and project meetings and so forth, I would throw out these one-liners that I had picked up along the way through readings and talking to people, or some that I just made up. And I initially started calling them sound bites. And one of my staff said, you should write these down. And I started writing them down and keeping track of them. And uh, so I had, a number of these. And what I first decided to do was to use them to create a course for leadership teams that I managed and other people managed, at the boards I was on and so forth. And I found that we needed to develop, how do I organize? I came up with, after culling the list, came up with 45 items that I felt were really important. And what makes this a bit different is that um, they were comprehensive of all the skills that they related to all the skills that you need in becoming a leader and to moving to, even improvements in that leadership. So after a lot of research on each one of them, I had to come up with a model. How do I organize these? And came up with a leadership model that perhaps it might be good to describe that now, even though it wasn't exactly one of your questions. I think
No,
it'd
keep
be
going.
good to discuss that. You can think of a house. A house has a foundation which holds up the entire house, has a structure which gives the house form, and it has a roof and holding everything together. Well, if you look at leadership, um, the foundation of leadership is the ability to manage oneself. So I say, okay, if you think of a house that you have a house of leadership, you have a foundation which is managing oneself. The idea is if you can't manage yourself, you probably can't lead or manage anyone else,
Right.
right? So you've got to develop those skills. And then the structure has two major parts. There are interpersonal skills, the softer aspects of the job, and management skills. And a lot of leadership literature doesn't talk about the management skills that you really need. They try to just focus on the inspirational part, the visionary part of leadership, which is very important. But you also need the executional part, the management skills. And then how do you tie it all together? Well, you tie it all together, and the roof is I depict it as strategy and alignment. And I connected them together because if everyone's not in the organization is not aligned to the strategy, it doesn't work very well. That's really essential to have a good leadership. So that's the model. So then I took the 45 touchstones and put them into one of these four categories. Now it's arguable whether one should be in one or the other, and some of them overlap. But basically, there's four categories, and so the book is structured into four parts where we talk about each of these touchdowns. Now your original question or your first question was how did you come up with the title Touchstones? Well, very interesting. I started out calling them sound bites, and then and that was the first title of the course that I gave, Sound Bites of Leadership. And then in putting it together in book form and in discussions with my publisher, Forbes, they suggested that sound bites was an older term and it wasn't as enduring. And they say, "Do you have any other ideas?" So I pondered that for a while and came up with touchstones. That idea is touchstones meaning truths. And in one definition is truth. Of course, the original touchstone was used in the precious metals industry for gold. That you had this particular stone, and if you rubbed the gold on that stone, it could tell you the quality by having a standard. You could look at whether this is one real gold or whether it had what the quality of that gold was back in the early days. So, and the term touchstones is much more enduring than the term sound bites. So we came up with the touchstones of leadership with a subtitle, essential principles, and because that's what they are, basically principles, or I like to even talk them as guidelines or guideposts. They're not rigid rules. They're not in fact, you'll find some of them that actually appear to conflict with each other, especially when we get into the harder area of strategy, where, when to leave your strategy and move on to another one and give your strategy a chance, make sure you're not, so don't double down all the time on a particular strategy, but also don't, as one of them says, don't pull up don't pull the flowers up to see if the roots are healthy. You
Mm.
know, people constantly changing their strategy. That is so. That's the the essence of what what the book entails. And I think what's unique is the model. I haven't found that anywhere in all the research I've done. Um, and that it pulls the softer skills together with the executional skills that are necessary. And I think that that insight will give people an idea of what leadership's all about. It's not just the visionary piece. There's the day-to-day hard work, grind it out piece of leadership, dealing with personnel problems and all these other things are just absolutely necessary because, the leader gets involved of whatever level you're leading, whether it's first level, second level, but whatever level, you get involved with a lot of detailed problems. And the key is how do you make sure that the right ones are delegated and to notice that if the really easy problems get to the CEO, your organization is not working very well.
Right.
Only the hard problems should get to the top, right? That other people can't solve because they either don't have the resources or they don't have the vision, the complete picture of what's going on in the industry and the company.
Hmm. Use the house as the analogy, but later you were talking about the four different areas where each of those 45 touchstones kind of fall into. How do you define those four areas?
Well, the managing oneself tends to emphasize
So that
um,
is the definition of the first area is managing
right,
oneself.
managing oneself.
Okay.
It emphasizes the importance of focusing on what you can control and and not focusing on the things that are outside your control. I think the concept of focus, the concept of trustworthiness comes in there, and trustworthiness is and this is more when you're teaching, the leaders under you. It requires competence and character. And a lot of people, when they think of trustworthiness, they only think of character. Is the person honest, truthful, and so forth? But if they don't have the competence in the area, then you either have them in the wrong place, or they're just not going to be trustworthy. They may be honest as the day is long, but you can't trust them because they're not able to in a competent
Execute.
and execute right.
Yeah. And then I
And
think just to your point, the word trust, it actually has a couple different definitions. Because the way, to your point, most people think trust is that person going to lie to me or are they going to be honest, right? That's kind
right,
of where our brain goes first.
right,
But
right,
if I'm an employee and I'm under somebody's leadership and they don't know how to steer the ship, it's a different type of trust. I don't trust them to make the right decisions to steer
exactly.
the ship and make this a successful venture.
Yeah, I think Stephen Covey, if you're familiar with his work, he uses the example of the honest surgeon, but who's not very competent, and the surgeon who is not very honest is really competent, does a lot of unnecessary operations and makes a lot of money. And so you wouldn't want him, but you don't want the other one either, who botches the surgery, right? He
Right.
he only does the necessary ones, but doesn't do them very well. So either one, you can't trust either one. So I think your point's right on.
So the first area was yourself.
Managing oneself, which we talked about, trustworthiness and focus and ongoing professional development. You have to improve yourself and you have to, build upon your strengths and understand, how to build upon your strengths. So I
Well,
think that's managing oneself.
I want to dig into each of those four areas, but define the other three for me, please.
Okay, the other three are interpersonal skills,
Yep.
management skills,
Yep.
and strategy and organizational alignment as one does the fourth area.
Okay. So let's touch on those four. So
Right.
managing yourself. Can you define what it would look like or paint a picture for me? What does it look like when somebody isn't adequately managing themselves? And then in contrast, what does it look like when somebody is adequately managing themselves?
Yeah, when someone isn't managing themselves well, they usually are in constant chaos. They don't they become overly reactive, knee-jerk reactions, decisions that don't make sense. The last person to come in and visit them, that's who they're following, that they're following their suggestions. So they're not actively looking at the business, but it's because their personal self is not organized enough or ask the right questions or and so forth. So when you manage yourself, you're constantly thinking of, what am I doing today? Prioritization. Maybe that's the best way to explain it. People who manage themselves well are able to prioritize their day and their week, usually by the week. I like to prioritize by the week rather than the day because especially when you're at the higher level of leadership, because there's certain things like personnel issues, human resource issues. Sometimes you just have to bag your whole schedule and go solve them because they can get very bad very fast.
So the person that's not managing themselves, they're not prioritizing correctly. Um, what are some of the aspects of a leader where because one thing that pops in my mind is continuous improvement, learning. There's certain habits that I think an effective leader should have, and maybe some of that is encapsulated in your 45 touchdowns. So, what do you think are some of the critical aspects of that all leaders should incorporate into their weekly routine?
Yeah, I think you brought up one is improving yourself on a consistent basis, and I think that um, that's a characteristic of a good leader. It's constantly looking to improve oneself. And personally, what worked for me personally was reading, getting into the office, an hour early and doing some very quiet time, reading some good books on leadership and or other specific aspects of management, something that you see things coming up in your plan and you want to learn more about them. So I think uh, doing those kinds of things uh, are really important, and staying up with what's going on in the business world, in your particular industry, in your particular niche, what's going on, what the competition's doing. Those are the kinds of things that a leader needs to make sure they have a good handle on so that they can move the organization as things change. So that's a really, really important aspect. And understand where the workforce is going too, because over the number of decades that I've seen so many shifts in how to deal with people that's necessary, because younger people want different things and as you're moving along, and that doesn't mean that you change your whole business structure because of it, but you have to understand what people want. So it's the understanding the people side of things. I think it's up to the leader um, to understand what's going on as you're bringing in a different group of people into your organization, and how can your HR policies and rewards and so forth adapt to to what's going on. And one thing I liked about your book that I agree with is the profit sharing incentive approach that you promote versus a more traditional um,
Merit-based.
yeah, yeah. I like where the whole team gets rewarded or they don't if you don't make a profit and you share that on a probably on a different trajectory depending if you really hit it out of the park, then the share should be a larger percentage as well. But I think that approach, I've been in organizations and I've run organizations that you did it all different ways. And that's been the most successful way in my experience. Creates fewer problems. People feel that they're getting rewarded for what they do. So I really like that in your book. Um, and In fact, I found that there was a customer of mine who was the president of a business, um, and we were supplying them with, this was in the aerospace business, and he came and gave us, he went around to all suppliers. And that's another thing a good leader does, make sure they understand all the stakeholders. I talked about employees and so forth, but you have five basic stakeholders in any business. You have the owners or the shareholders, you have the employees, you have the customers, extremely important, obviously. You have suppliers, and you have the community in which you operate. And all five, have to get value from you, or it doesn't really work very well. But one of the things that our customer gave back to us was he was the one that convinced me of this approach, the profit sharing approach, and how he incentivized his teams all the way down to the manufacturing floor that shared in that, and how that worked. And he came and gave us a long presentation on that and convinced me 100% that that was the way to go. And we started transitioning the business I was into that approach. And you get resistance. You get tremendous resistance from certain people until they really see that we're all a team, and everyone, including the janitor, as you pointed out, is going to keep things going well. And one of the interesting things, and I'm digressing a little bit. There's a story. I believe it's true, but I've never been able to see any, actual evidence. But the story went around the aerospace industry was some high-level person was visiting NASA, the launch center at the Kennedy Space Flight Center, and he was a very congenial guy. He went around, shook everybody's hand, and he saw the janitor there, and he walked over and he said, what do you do here? And he said, I help put people into space. He knew the mission and he was contributing, even though he was, but he felt part of that mission. And it's the same thing, that you should get rewarded for that mission, right? And not, because now you're going to be extra, take extra special care to take care of the facilities and make it look nice and make sure, that you clear the way for people and so forth. So I think that's again how you can promote what a good leader does. And I think the right incentive program is really, really, really fine. The one you mentioned, the profit sharing approach.
Yeah. So we're starting to transition into managing yourself, and I think we're starting to touch on some of the interpersonal aspects, which is one of the four areas that you were talking about. Earlier, you mentioned there's lots of books that talk about this, right? And not so much about management, and I would agree with you. What are some of the aspects of that second area that you think deserve highlighting? And are maybe something that aren't typically found in other books that discuss similar topics.
Yeah, I think the aspect of effective communication and empathizing, which is covered in many things, especially Goldman's emotional intelligence and so forth, which started to change things. I've seen that from the interpersonal skills started to be emphasized more about 25, 30 years ago with the book Good to Great, where Jim Collins promoted level 5 leadership, and then shortly thereafter Goldman with his emotional intelligence and aspect. And the key from that I found, and it may not be emphasized everywhere, is to take that if you look at when you're dealing with people, to take responsibility for those relationships. To me, the interpersonal side, it's all about relationships. And if you keep in your mind that my idea is to build a relationship with you in the workforce side, but also on the customer side, I've got to build a relationship. That customer is trusting me to to build them something or provide a service or do something. And he or she doesn't want to waste their time or get something that's inferior. Mm, So it's about that relationship. They need to trust you. In the pharmaceutical area, really, as pharmaceutical services, we're making active ingredients, especially for the branded drugs. And especially the smaller drug companies, they have one or two products that they're trying to take to market, and they're trying to get into the clinic and so forth. And if you, as a manufacturer, they're trusting you with their company, basically when they hand you the documentation for their molecule and what you have to do and their internal process, and now you're trying to adjust the process so it can be manufacturable. It's like it's like a mother handing her child to daycare, right? I mean that this is their baby and they're trusting you with it. And if you get into trouble, if you especially have an FDA problem, a regulatory problem, I mean, their project is put on hold. You can't deliver anything. You can't put it into the clinic. I mean, it is a real problem. So I think this aspect of interpersonal skills to get that of course, you have to have everything to back it up, but I mean, to get that customer to trust you to take their product to the next step, where they're just doing lab work and animal studies. Now they're giving you the process so they can take it into the clinic. So you've got to manufacture it according to good manufacturing practices and so forth and so on, and have all the quality documentation. So, so it's the relationships, and then breaking that down, trust is the basis of all those relationships. And we talked about trust before, what the components of trust are and so forth.
Yeah. Now, to the audience that's listening, I'm gonna step out on a limb and assume that most, if not all of them, are gonna say, "Well, I'm good with interpersonal stuff. I don't need any help there. I know what I'm doing." Paint a picture for me for somebody that thinks they're doing that correctly, but they're not. What are some of the signs they might see that could give them an indication that maybe they need to re-examine how they're going about that aspect of their work life? And then similarly, what are some signs of behaviors where it signals that somebody's on the right track?
Yeah, I think when you're on the wrong track in interpersonal skills, you're seeing a lack of feedback from, especially internally, from your employees. We can talk about external separately, but internally, you're not getting the feedback, without constantly probing.
Mm,
That means that there's only one way communication, and that's not good. You should have people coming to you and and uh, and and giving you information and telling you in a, in the appropriate way when maybe you're a little wrong and maybe we should do it this way and do it that way and and so I think when you see a lack of feedback that's coming unsolicited, then it's not working well. And I think then it's just the opposite if that's true, if you're seeing that. And one of the best pieces of advice I ever got, and I mentioned this in the book, was from my dad. Um, my dad worked in a factory most of his life. Right? He was an hourly worker, worked on the floor, shipping and receiving, doing all those things. He didn't have the opportunity for an education that he gave me. And uh, he's when I was and I had moved out to the West Coast and I was at Aerojet and then in addition to running R&D and development and testing and that kind of thing, they promoted me and also gave me manufacturing responsibility. And I was talking to my dad and I told him, "Hey, Dad, I just got a promotion. I'm now going to be in charge of manufacturing and everything." He said, "One of the things you should do is go down and talk on the floor and talk to the people who are doing the manufacturing." He said, you know, and ask them what you should be doing and so forth, especially when you're bringing new products. And he said when I was, working, that was unheard of. He said we would be manufacturing something or even in shipping and receiving, and the industrial engineers would come down with their clipboards and their stopwatches and try to determine what the best way to do these things were. And he said, no one ever asked us. He said, we knew how to take how to do it much more efficiently, but no one ever asked us. And in those days, he said, no one, and we weren't expected to speak up, and we didn't speak up because when we did speak up, we got shot down by the engineers. They didn't respect our comments. So that's the way it was. He said, try to change that. And it was one of the best pieces of advice I ever got. So that was, my first stint in manufacturing. I was still a fairly young guy, went down, talked to the people and everything. And we were in a facility where we had development manufacturing, commercial manufacturing on the first floor, and we had engineering and other office functions on the second floor of this building. And it was amazing after a while talking to both the engineers and the operators. I would walk around the facility and see operators that came up to the second floor and it was sitting down with the engineer and saying, if you just change this thread a little bit, I can make this part in half the time. Can you do that? Will that work? And so I saw this collaboration going on. And it all comes from this in my mind, it all comes from this interpersonal skills of getting people to talk to each other. So when it's not working right, people aren't talking to each other, you have silos. And I think the best way to break down silos is to create these interpersonal skills. And when you see that happening, then that it's going right.
Yeah. Now, I agree with everything you said. One of the things that I've noticed is getting unsolicited feedback on how you can do things better. Sometimes um, there's a barrier to that, which is if it's somebody speaking up to somebody that's responsible for hiring and firing, there's a little bit of hesitation
Yes.
because of that power imbalance.
Yes.
And I think all good leaders want that type of feedback. They desire that feedback, and they do everything they can in order to try to uh, slim the veil or create enhanced safety. So, what are some pieces of advice that you would give to leaders where they're looking for people that maybe they have hiring and firing power over to feel safe and secure and trust them to be able to speak up and provide them with different inputs and guidance.
Yeah, one of the things that, immediately comes to mind, and could be also that I've recently read your book, is skip level meetings. And I've used that technique many, many times over my career. And at first, people are, especially the management layer that's left out of the meeting, they start to, grumble and so forth. But eventually they come along. But that opens the door for amazing communication. I can't believe how much I found out, by having those meetings. There are other processes also. Especially like when you get a new manager in, there's sometimes people are reluctant to provide information because now you brought in a new manager, nobody knows that person. And one of the things that we did was, we called it new manager immersion or something like that. And we would have a facilitator, usually a consultant, but it could be an internal facilitator as well. Have a meeting with the people in the group where this new manager is taking over without the manager,
Hmm.
and then we get people to, on a no acknowledgement basis, to ask questions and express their concerns about having a new manager, and anything that they may have heard about this person and so forth. And they would put it on flip charts, but no attribution for who asked what and who said what. And then all of these flip charts were then collected and given to the new manager with the facilitator, and they went over each one of them. The facilitator added, maybe some color to it and so forth. And then the manager came in and met with his team with the flip charts and went through each one of them and explained and so forth. And it just broke the ice. It was unbelievable. It takes a lot of time, and people sometimes don't think they have the time, but it's time well spent. So
Hmm.
you spend a half a day with the group and the facilitator, and another half a day to analyze it, and another half a day to meet with the team again. And you've improved the communication many times over.
Hmm.
And so that new manager doesn't have that resistance that is inevitable when it happens. And you keep that community. So that's just one technique. I'm not saying that's the way to do it. I'm not saying that's the prescription. It's one technique that I was involved with, which I really, really like. I was involved with it both ways as the new leader, and I was involved with it when a new CEO came in, and I was at the VP level at that time. And that's how I got the idea when I, got put over. We did this when I got put over into pharmaceuticals because who is this aerospace guy coming in at the president level of this new, right? What does he know about pharmaceuticals,
Hmm.
and all of that. So it really worked. It really worked well. In fact, that was a great experience. So that's
Yeah.
just one experience.
Yeah, and I think a sense of humility, especially as I was thinking about the aerospace guy coming in, kind of helps break down some people's walls in the sense that they're not coming in knowing everything and they're really relying on you to help them become successful, I think is important. The other thing, it just as it pertains to this interpersonal aspect that we're talking about, is when it comes to developing relationships with employees, colleagues, and clients. Just like muscle, it can atrophy over time. And so as soon as you've got it, you're not done, right? So as soon as I break the world record for, bench pressing, it doesn't mean, oh, I'm done. And then a year later I can come back and do the same thing.
Right.
You always have to be working on it and it never goes away. I also like the way you've been talking because you're really making it easy for me. We're starting to transition into the management piece, and I would agree with you. This is something that I think a lot of leadership and management books they really like to talk about the kind of for lack of a better term, soft and fuzzies and high
Right.
level, types of things, but just kind of like trust, right? You need good character, but you also need competence. As it pertains to management or and leadership, you need good character, but you need competence. So, can you talk a little bit about management and what are some of the touchstones that apply to that?
Yeah, I think a good leader needs to have, a certain amount of business acumen, not just the visionary aspects that you just mentioned and so forth, and the other softer aspects, and 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 provide tools to his team. So I think there's a big teaching part of management that is really important that's missing from a lot of discussions here. I think your people expect you to teach them what you know.
Mm,
And there's so many old-fashioned managers who want to hold on to all the
mm,
information, right, to protect their position. So it's that teaching aspect is really important. And then there's, the other aspect of management is putting the right people in the right place. I found that you very often when someone's not performing well, it's because they're in the wrong job. It's not because they're not a good person. I think most people want to do a good job, but they get frustrated because they're in something that they're just not good at. And that's where understanding the difference between talent and skill is really important. And different people will define it different ways. There's a study by I think his name is Buckminster, who it was a Gallup study, and they interviewed tens of thousands of different managers and so forth, and um, and they came up with defining talent as a behavior that's recurring that will give productive value. So there's a behavior, a thought, a feeling that's recurring, and it's built into the person. It cannot be taught. True talent cannot be taught. And it's easy in the sports world to recognize that, right? I mean, talent is real easy in the sports world to say, you know, this guy's got great hand-eye coordination because you can watch it, right? Whereas this person, needs to be a lineman because they're 350 pounds, right?
mhm,
And that kind. So the sports world is very easy. The 6'8" and above, they play basketball, but as long as they're coordinated enough and so forth and on. But in the business world and in the operating world, it's much more difficult to find. And I think so you need that definition and figure out what and then different skills can be trained. So the example that this particular author likes to use is the one of what makes a great accountant. And it's only one of many that he discusses, but it's the one that I recall most of the time, is a penchant or a strong desire for precision. If you he believes that's a real talent that you really can't train, and that if you don't have that talent, you're not going to be a good accountant. You might be a good finance guy and understand all the finance aspects, but you're not going to be a great accountant.
mm,
Uh, you might be adequate, but you're not going to be a great accountant unless you have that penchant for precision. And we all don't have that, right? I mean, I'm more of a big picture guy, and and like to simplify things, and so I focus on being accurate, but sometimes to get your point across, you can be accurate, but you have to be less precise to get it across. If you know
mm.
what I mean.
Yep.
And you don't want to give all the details. You want to give the big picture aspect of what you're trying to get across. So understanding that and putting people where their natural talent and understanding. So it's getting to know your people and putting them in jobs and positions that bring their talents out. He brings up another one in the nursing area. He says that, the for many, many years that, they felt nurses shouldn't get too close to their patients and shouldn't have that kind of bond. And when they did all their research, and it's really well documented research in his book. I think his book is called First Break All the Rules. And
Oh
and
yeah,
uh,
I know what you're talking about. Yep.
you know that one.
Yeah.
And he says, that they found after doing all this research that the best nurses are the ones that had this actually caring aspects, and that's a talent. I mean, everyone doesn't have that caring aspect. I mean, they care if a person's hurt or something like that, but they don't have that. I've got to make you better. I've got to help you through your turmoil and so forth. They made the best nurses and so forth. And so in business, it's finding the right talent and match that to the right job or the right task.
Mm.
Uh, and so I think that's a real aspect. And then of course, then when you get people going, empowering them and listening to what they have to offer and let them do their thing, so to speak. And the other part I mentioned already was the teaching aspect. I think that's really important that managers have to understand part of their job is to teach.
Hmm.
And they have to take the time when they're doing something to teach them what they know.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. I want to jump into the fourth area, which is strategy. I think you may have heard this, that culture eats strategy for lunch. And so I can understand that point of view. But similar to a lot of the leadership and management books where they're really focused on the interpersonal as opposed to the management aspect, um, there are some really good books on strategy. Maybe not enough books on strategy or enough really good books. So talk about some of the touch points with strategy because I'm sure there's a lot of leaders and managers there and they might say, I feel like I manage myself and, I'm pretty interpersonal and I know how to manage people. But the strategy piece, how do I get in the zone in order to optimize that aspect of my day-to-day, week-to-week, year-to-year?
Yeah, I think it's understanding the first they have to really understand what strategy is all about and what makes a good strategy and what makes a bad strategy, so to speak. Um, and most people don't have a good idea of that. They have to be taught that, and it can be taught. I mean, it's not like a basic talent that's inbred, but there are two aspects of strategy that comes out of Michael Porter, who was one of the legacy guys at Harvard on strategy. And just to digress a second, there's been an interesting book because Porter's stuff is very scholarly, but it's really hard to read. You have to read
Oh,
his stuff over and over again.
okay.
But there's a book from one of his editors for the Harvard Business Review, and she's fantastic. Joan Magretta wrote a book, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago.
Joan who?
Magretta, I think her name is.
Magretta? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. It's called Understanding Michael Porter, is the title of the book.
Okay.
And it is fantastic. It's a quick read. It
Uh,
breaks down everything he talks about strategy. But there are two things that I highlight and well, there's more than two, but two that come to mind right now that I highlight is strategy, the fundamental principles that if you keep in mind when you're developing your strategy, you won't go too far off. One is strategy is about being different, choosing to be different, and strategy is often choosing what not to do. You can often in business say, well, boy, we could do this, we could do this, we could do this. Look at we could, but it comes down to focus. And this gets us back to uh, the first part, managing oneself, this idea of focus. And so I think those two aspects of strategy are very, very important when you're developing a strategy. What makes us different? Um, and why will people come to us versus going to one of our competitors? So what that tells you is just copying a competitor is not a good strategy. Operational excellence is not a good strategy. Operational excellence is necessary to stay competitive, but it's not a good strategy because it's easily copied, right? Everyone's going to learn all the different, Toyota manufacturing system and whatever, and they're just going to get to the same level of competence. So, and the whole idea is what are you competing for? And you can't think of your competitor as you're building your strategy as you're going to war with your competitor. You're not competing what you're competing in your industry when you define your industry, what you're in is you're competing for profits, and that's what you're competing for. You're not at war with your competitor and assuming your competitor will fail because you're better than they are is a poor strategy.
Mm.
Because as I go in the book, your competitor can team up with a supplier, your competitor can team up with another competitor and overcome their weaknesses, and you don't even know what's happening. All of a sudden, it happens. And I give an example in the book where we teamed up with a competitor to take a bundle of products away from the two most likely winners, and they were just flat-footed. So you've got to think of unique ways of being different. And then, as I said, you've got to choose what not to do. What are you going to be? You can't be all things to all people. You just can't. And then you got to build your supply chain such that what's critical to your strategy you do in-house. What's not critical to your strategy you can outsource. It goes against the rule, the old rule, which was the concept of core competencies. I'm only going to do in-house what I'm really good at, which is good. That's absolutely true. But what you need to add to that and build the capability of anything that's in your supply chain that is critical for your strategy. And one of the examples that I point out is in the in the foods and beverage area and even the cosmetics area, um, the world is changing to going more towards natural products. I mean, especially in Europe, but we're seeing it here. We're going more and more towards natural products in food so the ingredients that go into food, the colors, the flavors, all these chemical ingredients are shifting to natural. When they were synthetic, your input your input materials were chemicals of certain sorts, and you could find anybody to make them, and you could compete them on price, and you could get those chemicals in. They were not unique to your strategy. Your strategy was how you built the final item. But now, your supply chain in natural ingredients, your supply chain are farmers because you're taking beets and you're extracting the red color out to make a natural color instead of red number three, which is now
Hmm.
going to be banned, right? So forth and so on. So as your supply chain becomes more strategic, you've got to be careful to adapt to that. And so you may want to go out and cut a unique deal with a farmer or develop your own seeds. And these are completely different capabilities. But if you're going to get into natural products, that's going to be a discriminator. If you
Mm.
have proprietary seeds that are better than someone else's. So the rules of the game change when you move so the synthetic color suppliers that and flavor suppliers that don't make that transition, you know, I mean, there'll still be synthetic materials that they can provide, but they won't be on the front end of what's going on. So, and you can think of electric vehicles as another aspect. The big thing in electric that at least it looks now one of the big discriminators would be the lithium batteries, right? And I think the people that can find better batteries and then maybe keep that proprietary by manufacturing those batteries themselves rather than buying them, which would then level the playing field if that anybody could buy these, that will be a discriminator because that's going to be discriminator on the range, the price, the weight, and all of that of electric vehicles. So these are the kinds of things as the technology changes in the products, this you can't keep the supply chain the same. You've got to do something different. So that's another strategy that people often don't think of.
Mm.
And I do point that out in the book as well. And again, a lot of these ideas don't originate with me, but it originate with the masters of this, like Michael Porter and other people that put strategy together. It's that a lot of people don't apply it because it's not readily available. It's taught in some business schools, but it's not relied on. But strategy is most important, and it comes to do defining what you are. There are some great case studies, the International Harvester case. I don't have time to go into, but there's some great case studies of companies that completely died because they held on to a strategy, which when the industry changed. Um, I mean, you can look at you can look at the movie industry um, before television. They were just riding really high, and they thought, and most of them thought television was just a phenomenon that was going to go by the wayside. They didn't invest in television. Now, eventually, they caught up and started, but they started very, very late, and they were able to catch up. There are others that didn't. Um, the railroads thought they were in the railroad business, and this is a classic one, but they were in the transportation business. And when airplanes came, they didn't invest in airplanes, right?
Right.
But they had all the infrastructure to make reservations and give tickets and all of that, but they didn't change the technology. So these are the kinds of things with strategy, and it's very unique to each company.
Mm.
And found that every company's different. There's not a one size fits all. Um, and in the book we give a few other examples of people that didn't change their strategy, and then and those that do will and knowing when to change your strategy, as I mentioned in earlier in the conversation, that is really important. How to how to know when is really important. That's where you need good people giving you advice. Hey, this is what's happening in the industry. This is what's happening, and
Mm.
so forth. Yeah.
Well, I'm really excited to read your book, and I'd be even more excited if you said your next book was going to be on strategy, because that's really where I'd like to see you go next. Um, I want to do a little bit of a non sequitur. I want to bring up 3 points. We talked a little bit about the responsible realist prior to recording. I want to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about the difference between talents and skills. And then, again, just to give you another ball to juggle, when we think about strategy and when to stay the course and when to change, the big disruptor right now is AI. So if you have any insights that you could include there, that would be phenomenal.
Okay, great. Okay, responsible realist was a term that evolved from my work on putting this book together, and well, putting the course together originally, and then converting it into a book or evolving it into a book. The idea came from the observation that business is about realism. Yeah, you can have some idealistic principles and so forth, but it's all about realism. It has to be real. And I said, yeah, but you can't just talk about realism, there are other responsibilities you have, and I came up with the term responsible realist, where what is a responsible realist? Well, on the responsible part of the side, of course, the business leader has to, adhere to ethical and legal principles and standards, treat everyone fairly and respectfully, respect the environment, maintain honesty in openness in sales and marketing, ensure safety in your products or services, and provide safe working conditions for your employees. So, that's the responsible part. The realist part is acknowledge that the world, you have to be able to acknowledge that the world is imperfect
Mm,
and accept things that are outside your control and influence as they are. You have to accept certain things and then work your strategy around those things and not try to change the world because you'll never get done. So this means you have to adhere to a schedule. So you're realistic and say the world, your products and services won't mean anything if they come too late. So you've got a schedule to deal with. And so you need to use these realities to build a strategy that we just talked about. And the idea is you got to create value for all the stakeholders in the business. And we mentioned them before, the customers, the employees, the suppliers, the customers, the owners, and the community in which you operate. So everyone's got to win, so to speak, in that, or your company doesn't do very well, and your leadership quality doesn't excel. So that's the responsible realist.
mm.
Um,
Let me ask one question before you move on to skills and talents. Um, what would be a good example? Because I think part of the concept of the responsible realness is realist is, there's all these really empathetic ways of working with people and, trying to trust them and prop them up and treat them well. But there's the nuts and bolts of business, and you have to understand that, if the environment's changing, then I need to adapt and not just think everything's going to kind of turn out the way I hope it to be. So, what are some of the touchstones that maybe intersect with the responsible realist that people can, latch onto?
um, well, I think it's understanding it's this whole idea of focus that I mentioned and early or very early in the conversation that and I think Covey gives a great example um, of the concept of the circle of concern and the circle of influence. So you have a large circle of concern, which is everything that you're worried about in business, and then there's the circle of influence, the smaller circle at whatever level of management you are in or leadership. Um, there are certain things that you can control and influence, and that's where your focus should be.
Mm,
You should focus on that. So, touchstone number one is basically don't worry about things that are outside your control. That doesn't mean you don't know about them and watch them and maybe have ways of mitigating any influence of that, but that's not your main concern. You focus on that. And then if you're at first level of management, you're focusing on that. If you start working on that, you'll find that circle will expand. Your circle of influence in the company will expand. And of course, that's how you eventually get promoted and everything. So you got to start working toward the edges of that circle. So it's interesting that um, when Bill Gates and Warren Buffett first met, it was at a dinner where Gates's mother hosted this dinner, and there were a number of people there. And after the dinner, they were chatting, and the one question came up was, what what made you say what is the single most important thing that made you successful? And both Gates and Buffett answered the question identically with the same word, and it was focus. One
Hmm.
word answer was focus. That they felt that focus is what gave them. So I think that whole aspect of focus is part of the realist and aspect that that you need to embed in your thinking and helps you not waste time, helps you not um, not worry about things. There's really nothing you can do about it. Because in my experience, I've seen employees at all levels worry about, well, will the company be sold? Is there a new CEO coming in? What's he going to do? What's going to happen to my job? Well, you can't control any of those. The best thing you can do is do the best you can at your job, and hope that that takes care of itself as you move forward.
So is that essentially what you mean by focus is only focusing on those things that you have control and influence over?
Um, Well, I think that's one of the guidelines, one of the touchstones.
Hmm.
And it doesn't mean that, as you're in higher levels and you're developing a strategy, you may then, alter that focus and say, I don't have influence here, but I'm going to go get help. I'm going to go get, a capability to go do that. I'm going to go buy a company, that and that kind of thing. So it depends, but certainly at the mid level, which is extremely important part. In fact, in my I didn't talk about some of the work I do in mergers and acquisitions right now with my colleague in Europe. That's one of the most important things in determining whether there's a fit or not is this idea of where am I going to focus and how's that all going to come together. And so that's a very important aspect of mergers and acquisitions.
Okay, thank you. Would you please discuss the difference between talents and skills? And then I also wanted to remind you that I'd like to get your insight into AI and how that's affecting everything as it pertains to your 45 touchstones.
Sure. Talents and skills, I'll go back to, the definition that we talked about before, which is, a behavior that's recurring and is productive and adds value. And I think we talked about, the talent of, identifying someone who really has this penchant for precision as an accountant and so forth, versus skills are just, all the other things that can be learned
Okay.
uh, in that can be taught and where you can then bring people along with the
So,
idea that the embedded talent, in other words, you don't want to put someone in a position where they just don't have the talent. They're just never going to learn that position. You got to move them. And it's like if you have a person running R&D who is extremely adverse to risk taking, or vice versa, having a person running the quality assurance
that is
function
into risk taking.
that is into risk taking. So you want the person who is more concerned. Not, I don't want to say concerned is probably the wrong word, but the have that, is very careful, doesn't take unnecessary risks, wants to see the success of the business, wants to make sure all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed and everything. That's the person that should be running quality assurance. Person running R&D is the one that's thinking about AI, which we're going to talk about next, or is thinking about how can I incorporate this into this? And and comes in and says, can I have $50,000 to explore this? I don't know if it's going to work, but here's what I think will happen if it does, and
Hmm.
that kind of thing. He's not afraid to come in. So that's these two people have different talents, and it's very hard for them to switch. I I've not seen people that far apart able to flip the switch in their head about being risk adverse. I just and go running an R&D organization, even though they might be a good researcher themselves, on the bench, but when they move into the leadership of defining what to do, that they fail. And that's another thing we didn't talk about, but is promoting someone who's a great individual contributor to a leader or a manager of something without giving them any training whatsoever. It's done all the time. Just because you're good at doing this job doesn't going to be good. You're going to be managing a group that does that job. I mean, it just the talents are different. The embedded talents are different.
Yeah, it
So
sounds like nature and
I gotta,
nurture.
yeah,
Yeah,
yes, yes,
right. Some
yes,
people are born with just a different rhythm, and then you can adapt skills to complement that rhythm.
right.
But trying to fit a somebody with this rhythm into an area where they're on different frequencies, it doesn't matter how many skills you add to it, it's still not going to line up exactly.
Exactly, those essential aspects, and that's what I'm calling talent, and what other people have called talent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me give you a guided question as it pertains to AI. So as I look at these 45 touchstones, and we think about as we're entering this new revolution of artificial intelligence, um, what are some of the touchstones that you would encourage the listeners and subsequently the readers to really latch on to and don't let go? And then maybe what are some of the touchstones that are to be determined or maybe could be affected because of artificial intelligence?
Yes, one of the touchstones is a quote from Einstein: Imagination is more important than knowledge."
Hmm.
And I think it's this area of imagination where people can start using these new capabilities. The way I look at how you can get to innovation, and it's all about how can you spur innovation? How can you use AI to spur innovation? Let's talk about how innovation happens. This touchstone brings it up. Imagination is more important than knowledge. And the reason that it's more important, the basic reason is knowledge is constrained by everything that we know, that anyone knows, right? Imagination goes beyond that. Imagination can envision something that never was,
Right.
right? So imagination, goes to it leads to curiosity. So now you become curious and say, gee, that's an interesting idea. Is it possible to make that happen? Then you get curious, you start thinking of ways to make it happen. And then you go out and talk to experts, or you go dig into knowledge, you do some research in the lab. I don't know what you do, but then you gain some knowledge. So in a circular fashion, you're doing imagination, curiosity, knowledge, and that happens. And as that happens, it leads to, as it starts to congeal, it leads to creativity. And then that creativity leads to innovation being defined as, something new that can add value to a customer.
Hmm.
So innovation, it's got to be, practical. It's got to actually happen. I mean, it could still be in a prototype stage or research stage, but that's an innovation. I don't call it innovation until you get to that point. And you bring up a great question now. How can AI influence this process of gaining knowledge? And I think it's in the idea of helping people be creative, because I I didn't believe it until um, I didn't believe creativity could be learned until I had an all-day visit at Pixar.
Mm.
Um, and I was on the external research advisory board for UC Davis, University of California, Davis. And on that board was a fellow from Pixar who was they called him the dean of Pixar University. So they had their internal educational process, and he was the dean of that process. So we held our meeting at Pixar at his invitation one time. So we all assembled there and we spent a full day, even to late into the evening. But we had our regular meeting, and then we had John Lasseter came in and talked to us, and he told us the whole issue with Toy Story 2, and that's a great story. It's I spent a couple sentences in the book on it. I won't take your time right now to discuss the whole Toy Story 2 aspect, but and came up with it. But what they made it very clear is that it's not about the special effects at Pixar, it's about the story.
Ah,
It's all about the story. If you have a lousy story, you can have all the special effects you want, it doesn't work.
right.
And so that was their big thing. But on the creativity side, so just before we had dinner there, we had a couple of hours where they took us to the Pixar training area, university area, and ran us through a couple of exercises that they do to help people become creative.
Hmm.
And it convinced me that there are ways to teach creativity, get people thinking in the right direction. One of the exercises was interesting. We broke up into groups of four, and they put us in four, and they had us stand in a circle. So, well, four
Yeah.
four people looking at each other, standing, and you had to create a story. And however, you had to create that story one word at a time, each person giving a different word. So, person said the man, what, and you just kept going around, adding words to the thing and creating this story. And it goes in all kinds of different directions, but it gets your mind really thinking, and there were a few other exercises as well. So I became a believer. So then I said, gee, I was looking I said, let me look up my alma mater, Drexel University in Philadelphia, and I went through the book, the courses and so forth, and they actually have a master's program on creativity in the liberal arts college there, and it's interesting that there are things around that teach people creativity. So I was on the Dean of Engineering's advisory board, and I was trying to get her to get this group from the liberal arts people together with the engineering. I had never made that happen, at least so far. And because I really think if you can get your engineers to start thinking more creatively now, add your question on top. AI, which is a tremendous tool. I mean, I've played around with, the chat stuff and all of that, and that's okay too. It helps you put thoughts together and so forth. But I think it's so powerful. I was on the board of a company called Irvine Sensors, and they were trying to build these cognitive circuits. And at the time, they were getting sponsored by Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and so forth. This was, number of years ago, 10, 15 years ago, and they were just starting all of this. And I went to a few um, where they had the big group at MIT that was doing this and so forth. So just the little I know about it, I think that the tools, if they're used properly, are going to be tremendous in I've seen it used. It has been used in pharmaceutical development of new compounds where they can go to the lab, make small quantities of all these different molecules and enzymes and things, and use primitive version of what's called AI today, and figure out which ones will work better, which ones will give you better, and then they only have to go to the lab and scale up, a fewer number of compounds. So it eliminates the trial and error process.
Hmm.
I think that's one because most innovation has some type of trial and error associated with it. So I think using AI to speed up the trial and error process is one area, and doing it much faster than was done by the old traditional design of experiments and things like that we did when I was in college and so forth. So I think those aspects of discovery, drug discovery, is continuing now. What I mentioned to um, the folks that were doing advertising. There's a company called That's Nice in the pharma services area. They do all the advertising and they do more than that. They have something called Pharma's Almanac that I think we now need to apply that AI to the manufacturing side, which is an area that I have a lot of more experience in than in drug discovery, but more in the manufacturing side. It's not been applied there effectively in my estimation, especially when you get to the biologics. Um, where you're trying to find the cell line that will give you the most productivity and so forth. I think those areas will really benefit from employing AI if it's done right. And I just don't know where the investment's going to come in from there. I haven't but someone, some really smart people should be able to get investment in that area to start applying it to the development, the process development, and research side of manufacturing. I think is an area where AI can really blossom. Well, not AI blossom, but the help the results of the of those studies.
Hmm. Yeah, I would agree.
Because we've got to bring the cost of pharmaceuticals down, and I mean, it just, especially when you get into the biologics. I mean, they're just unaffordable right now. And when you get into cell and gene therapy, and that's what's holding a lot of that's holding back cell and gene therapy. If you followed it, there's been a pullback over the last year, 2 years in venture money in that area. And while we keep predicting, well, it's going to get better next year, it doesn't seem to. It doesn't seem to, and I think it's because um, you know it's a complicated area because you've got the patient right in the middle of the whole thing, especially on the autologous version of gene therapy and so forth. So you've got to take the blood from the patient, then you got to process and put it back in. It's a really complex. How can you avoid that complexity? I mean, it's difficult and very expensive. So
Right.
those are the kinds of things I think where AI can help. Um,
Well, we'll all have to wait and stay tuned.
yeah, absolutely.
Well, this has been an awesome podcast. I really appreciate your time and your insight. Before we close, what would you like to leave the audience with? And for everybody that's interested in getting a copy of your book, where can they find it?
Well, I think I want to leave them with that while these are touchstones and guidelines, they are only that. They're not black and white kind of rigid rules or anything. And so in the end, good judgment on the part of the leader will overcome any of these rules because every company is different and every person is different, and we've got to treat everyone as individuals. And so that whole aspect, I mean, the common theme as you read through this is that it's all about trust and respect. You've got to get trust and respect in your organization, and you've got to rely on good judgment. And these touchstones are merely tools that help you think in the right direction and that aspect. Um, Book is available at at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target, all the online type approaches there. I it's designed to be a quick read. I know people have a lot to read, and that was the whole idea of coming up with these touchstones. The descriptions of them, while they're well researched, they're very short. I think the book can be read in a reasonable amount of time. My goal was 30,000 words, and I think I came up with 35,000 words. So not too bad, not too
Okay,
bad.
pretty close.
And so I think it's and I believe the Forbes folks did a good job of designing the layout of the book and so forth. So it's fairly easy to get through, and it doesn't have to be read in order. You can read it if there's a particular topic that you see in the table of contents that you want to jump into. You can do that. There's no reason to read it in order. There's no method to that. Once you understand, but you got to understand the model. And I think if you can just come away with the model as you go forward in your work, I think it'll be very, very helpful to you to keep that model in mind.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate it. This was awesome. For everybody listening, as always, if you find conversations like this valuable, please share it with a colleague or your professional network. If you haven't already, subscribe to get updates of new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast and follow the FDA Group on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see y'all next time.